Imagine you are holding a newborn, yours, or a close friend's, or a sibling you have loved your entire life. The moment is quiet and warm and significant in every way that matters. And then, without warning, without invitation, a thought arrives. What if I dropped them? What if I threw them across the room? And it's gone almost before it fully forms, replaced immediately by horror at the fact that you thought it at all. And now you are no longer in the warm, significant moment. You are in the aftermath of a thought you didn't ask for, trying to understand what kind of person has a thought like that in a moment like this. The answer is almost every kind, nearly all of them. You, very probably, included. This is the reality of intrusive thoughts, the uninvited, unwanted, ego-dystonic mental content that arrives in the minds of the vast majority of people and produces, in those people, a suffering that is largely invisible, because it is rarely spoken about, not because it is rare, because the person experiencing it is convinced, with great certainty, that they are the exception, that other people don't think like this, that the thought itself is evidence of something dark about them specifically. That conviction is the thing that causes the most harm, and it is almost never correct. In 1978, researchers Stanley Rachman and Paul De Silva did something simple and revealing. They collected samples of intrusive thoughts from people diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and then collected the same from people with no clinical diagnosis whatsoever. They then gave these samples to clinicians, without identifying which was which. The clinicians could not reliably distinguish between them. The content of intrusive thoughts in clinical and non-clinical populations was remarkably similar. Violent imagery, sexual imagery, thoughts about harm, socially transgressive scenarios. What differed was not the content. It was the response to the content. It was what each person did with the thought after it arrived. This finding, replicated in the decades since, forms the foundation of everything worth understanding about intrusive thoughts. The thought itself is not the problem. The relationship a person develops with the thought, the meaning they assign to it, the response they offer to its presence, is where the actual suffering begins and ends. If this is landing somewhere significant for you, take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find conversations like this one. And if understanding the deeper, less spoken mechanics of how the mind works is something you want more of, subscribing makes that work possible, because here is what the mind is actually doing when it produces an intrusive thought. The brain's generative systems, particularly the default mode network, active during rest and unguided mental activity, produce content continuously, drawing on a vast associative archive of everything the person has ever perceived, imagined, feared, or been exposed to. This generation process has no moral filter at the point of production. It produces material based on association, context, and the particular landscape of concerns the mind is currently carrying, not based on the values and intentions of the person inside it. The thought arrives before the self has had any say in whether it should, and the self, on receiving it, faces a choice: interpret the thought as information about who it is, or recognize it as noise from a generative system whose output does not constitute endorsement. The vast majority of people experiencing distressing, intrusive thoughts interpret it as information, and the specific content of the thought points, almost with cruel precision, at the values they most care about protecting. The parent who loves their child with a depth that is cellular and total has the most vivid intrusive thought about harm to that child. The person of scrupulous ethical integrity has the most disturbing morally transgressive thought. The most committed and faithful partner has the most disorienting intrusive thoughts about infidelity. This is not a coincidence. This is the generative system doing what it does, producing content from the full archive of human possibility, while the value system immediately registers the content as threatening, which marks it as significant, which causes the mind to allocate more attention to it, which makes it more likely to return. Psychologists call this process thought-action fusion, the cognitive distortion that collapses the distance between having a thought and being the kind of person who would act on it. It is the error that transforms an ordinary, meaningless piece of mental noise into a source of persistent shame. And it is the error that the person suffering most from intrusive thoughts makes most reliably, because they are, almost by definition, the person who cares most about the distinction between the thought and the action, who would be most devastated if the two were ever conflated, and who therefore cannot stop running the very test that keeps producing the same alarming result. The paradox here is the one that changes everything once it is understood. The distress you feel at the intrusive thought is not the sign that something is wrong with you. It is the sign that something is deeply right. A person who does not care about causing harm does not experience a violent, intrusive thought as horrifying. They experience it as a plan, or as nothing in particular. The horror is the evidence. The fact that the thought fills you with revulsion, that your first response to it is alarm rather than interest, that you are here watching a video trying to understand why you have thoughts you find disturbing. All of this is the clearest available evidence of your values, not a violation of them. What this means, practically, is that the response to intrusive thoughts, that most people instinctively reach for the suppression, the analysis, the confessional self-examination, the urgent attempt to disprove the thought by reviewing your own character are precisely the responses that sustain and amplify the problem. Daniel Wegner's White Bear research demonstrated this mechanism. The act of trying not to think about something requires monitoring for that thing, and monitoring generates it. The mind told to suppress a thought produces more of it. The mind that tries to analyze whether a disturbing thought means something dangerous produces the thought more frequently, because the analysis marks the content as significant, and significant content receives more processing, more returns, more prominence in the mental landscape. The alternative, the one that the research consistently identifies as most effective, is neither suppression nor engagement. It is what acceptance and commitment therapy calls defusion, the practiced skill of observing a thought without treating it as a verdict. Noting its presence there is a thought, without interrogating its content, without assigning it moral weight, without following the pull to determine what it says about you. You are not the thought. You are the awareness that noticed the thought. And that distinction, thin as it may seem at first, is everything. This does not mean the thoughts stop arriving. For most people, they don't. What changes is the relationship. The thought arrives. You notice it the way you might notice a strange sound outside the window, present, acknowledged, not acted upon, not followed, and your attention returns to the room you're actually in, the life you're actually living, the values you're actually guided by. The thought is permitted to exist without being given authority, and in the absence of authority, without the attention and the analysis and the urgency that mark it as important, it loses the power that comes from being treated as a problem. You are not the darkest thing your mind has ever produced. You are the person who found it disturbing, who cared that it was there, who wanted to understand it rather than act on it. The thoughts say something about you, just not what you feared they did. What has an unwanted thought made you afraid of about yourself? And has that fear ever asked whether the horror of it might be its own kind of proof? Intrusive thoughts don't define who you are, they're just your mind reacting, not reflecting your true intentions. If this helped you understand yourself better, hit the like button and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.